My name is Sarah, and I'm 30 years old. Today, I want to open up about a part of my past that I kept hidden for years because it was too painful to confront. There are moments in life we never imagine happening to us, yet when they come, they have the power to change everything. I never thought I'd find myself living in torment over a truth I still struggle to accept. My story isn't about love or familial joy, as people might assume, but rather about sacrifices and suppressed emotions. Many believe that love is the sole reason two people get married. But I knew from the start that this wasn't true in the case of my mother and stepfather. From the moment he entered our lives, I felt something was wrong. Over time, I came to realize that my mother was just a pretext. His real interest was me. My mother, Amir, owned a small boutique. After my father passed away when I was a child, she worked tirelessly to raise me and ensure we had a stable life. Her resilience and determination not only sustained us, but also turned her fashion store into a beloved establishment in our community. To me, my mother was the epitome of strength and independence. Life progressed smoothly, with my mother dedicating herself to her work while I concentrated on my education. When I started university, I entered a new chapter of my life. It felt like my first real escape from the protective bubble my mother had always kept me in, allowing me to experience the broader world for the first time. The early days at university were filled with new experiences, but everything changed the day I met Mr. Ethan, my philosophy lecturer, who later became my stepfather. From our first class, I was drawn to his teaching style. He helped me develop a deeper appreciation for the subject and shifted my perspective on life. Our conversations after class grew more frequent, and I quickly realized how much influence he had over my thoughts. However, it wasn't long before I began to sense something unusual in the way he looked at me. Initially, I dismissed it as a figment of my imagination, but over time, the feeling became impossible to ignore. There were moments during our conversations when his gaze felt different, more intense, almost as though he was seeing me in a way that went beyond the typical teacher-student relationship. It was a look filled with unspoken thoughts, carrying a silent intimacy that made me uncomfortable. I couldn't understand why his gaze unsettled me so much. It wasn't the usual look of guidance or encouragement from a mentor. Instead, it seemed to hold an expectation, a hidden meaning I couldn't quite grasp. As the weeks went by, it wasn't just his eyes. His behavior also began to change. He would stand closer whenever we spoke, sometimes placing a hand on my shoulder in a way that felt overly familiar. At first, these gestures seemed harmless, but they gradually began to weigh on me, making me increasingly uneasy. One afternoon, he asked me to stay after class to discuss the lecture. But unlike our previous conversations, this one veered into unfamiliar territory. He seemed eager to prolong our time together, and the atmosphere felt heavier, more suffocating. His behavior had lost the professional boundaries I expected, and I no longer felt the respect and distance that should exist between a teacher and student. Over time, I started finding excuses to avoid him. I declined his offers to help, citing a busy schedule, but in truth, I simply wanted to maintain my distance. I chose seats farther from the front of the classroom, avoided making eye contact, and occasionally arrived late to class just to avoid encountering him beforehand. I convinced myself that as long as I kept my distance, everything would return to normal. Without his unsettling gaze or unwelcome gestures, I thought I could escape the anxiety that had taken root inside me. For the rest of the school year, I stuck to this plan, and it seemed to work. With the boundaries I established, the discomfort began to fade, and I believed the problem had been resolved. However, I couldn't have predicted that my sense of security was only temporary. After finishing the school year and returning home, I noticed a change in my mother. She seemed unusually cheerful, her eyes sparkling and her laughter more frequent. It was as if she carried a secret joy she couldn't fully contain. Curious, I asked her about it, but she simply brushed it off, saying that she was happy because life was improving. Then, one afternoon as we sat together in the living room, she joined me on the couch with an expression of unrestrained happiness. Her face was radiant, and her eyes shone with delight. She told me she had met someone special and wanted to introduce him to me. Seeing her so overjoyed filled me with a sense of lightness. My mother had sacrificed so much for me over the years, dedicating her life to my upbringing while setting aside her own happiness. I felt a deep sense of relief knowing that my mother had finally found the happiness and joy she deserved. On the day she was set to introduce this special man to me, I was genuinely eager to meet him. The house was meticulously cleaned, and the dining table was beautifully arranged by my mother. Her excitement and delight were evident, and I hoped this man would bring her the comfort and love she had long been seeking. When the doorbell rang, my heart raced with anticipation. Mom hurried to answer it while I remained in the living room, imagining the man who would soon become a part of her life. But when the door opened and I saw Mr. Ethan walk in, my heart was struck by an indescribable shock. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. All the discomfort and unease I had felt around him came rushing back, surrounding me like a suffocating cloud. The man my mother loved and trusted so completely, the one she introduced with such joy, was the same person I had been trying so hard to avoid. A whirlwind of conflicting thoughts erupted in my mind. Why him? How had they met? Did he have ulterior motives? The unease in my chest surged as memories of his unsettling stares and inappropriate gestures came flooding back, clouding my ability to think rationally. I turned to my mother, searching her expression for any hint that she sensed something was amiss, but she seemed oblivious. Her radiant smile remained, and she introduced Ethan with nothing but pride and happiness, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. Mr. Ethan stepped inside, his demeanor calm and composed, his smile friendly and polite. He greeted me warmly, feigning surprise as he said he hadn't realized I was my mother's daughter. I forced myself to act equally surprised, but inside I was in turmoil. My mother, innocent and unaware of my internal conflict, was thrilled by what she saw as an unexpected coincidence. She and Ethan chatted animatedly about this connection, while I stood there feeling vulnerable and anxious, wondering who Mr. Ethan truly was and why he had entered my mother's life in such a different role from the one I had known. Was this all just chance, or was there something more to it that I couldn't see? From that day forward, life appeared to continue as usual. Ethan's behavior didn't raise any immediate alarms, and I saw no reason for concern. Mom and Ethan grew closer, their relationship developing naturally. My mother seemed happier than I had ever seen her, her smile brighter, her demeanor lighter. Before long, she decided to remarry, and Ethan officially became my stepfather. Everything seemed to fall into place. There were no unusual signs or behaviors from Ethan, and our family life felt peaceful and stable. Over time, I began to believe that I had been overthinking things. Perhaps my initial discomfort stemmed from the stress of adjusting to changes in both my mother's life and my own. Seeing her happiness, I gradually let go of my doubts and fears. Her joy with Ethan was undeniable, and I eventually gave them my blessing wholeheartedly, wishing my mother a life filled with the happiness she deserved. As time passed, I saw no troubling behavior from Ethan. Slowly, I began to blame myself for letting unfounded worries cloud my judgment. The love and care he showed my mother eased my concerns, and I found myself genuinely happy for them both. I convinced myself that my earlier anxieties had been nothing more than a product of my imagination and sensitivity. When I turned 22 and graduated from university, I began searching for my first job. Although I hadn't yet secured a position, I decided to help my mother at her boutique. This gave us more time to spend together, and Ethan often stopped by to assist with small tasks when he wasn't busy. Life continued smoothly, and I no longer had any lingering doubts about him. I believed wholeheartedly that he was a good husband to my mother and an integral part of our family. But then, on what would become the worst day of my life, everything changed. That day, I was unwell. My body weakened by a fever, and I stayed home from the boutique to rest. My mother encouraged me to take it easy, assuring me she would manage things at the store. I didn't give it much thought, trusting that I would feel better after some rest. Ethan, who had no obligations that day, remained at home with me. I felt no reason to worry or suspect anything. After years of living together, I had come to view him as a trustworthy person who cared deeply for my mother and our family. As I lay in bed, trying to sleep through the pain and exhaustion brought on by the fever, I felt a sense of safety in my home. But that sense of peace was short-lived. The unthinkable happened that day, in the very house I had always considered my sanctuary. Ethan came into my room, carrying a glass of water and some pills. He told me they were painkillers to help reduce my fever, his voice gentle and kind, giving me no reason to suspect anything amiss. My head was foggy from the fever, and I wasn't thinking clearly. All I wanted was to feel better and get some rest, so I took the pills from him without hesitation, swallowing them along with the water. I had no idea that this moment would mark the beginning of something terrible, something that would change everything. At first, everything seemed ordinary, and I didn't notice anything unusual. After finishing the drink, I felt no immediate effects. The medication didn't seem to be working yet, and I remained fully conscious of my surroundings. I lay in bed, expecting the fever to subside soon. However, about 20 minutes later, everything began to change. Ethan returned to my room, this time empty handed, without any pills or water. There was a strange look in his eyes that unsettled me, and as I tried to sit up, I was horrified to find that my body wouldn't move. A sudden paralysis spread through me, leaving me completely drained of strength. Panic rose inside as I realized I was utterly helpless. Despite my attempts to fight it, I could do nothing but lie there, frozen, my eyes wide open as Ethan approached. His face remained calm, but there was a gleam in his eyes that sent an icy chill down my spine. I struggled to move, but my body was entirely unresponsive. Even a single finger wouldn't budge. The feeling of helplessness terrified me, but the fear grew even more intense when he leaned in, his face close to mine, and smiled. This wasn't the warm, friendly smile I had once known. It was cold and unnerving. He whispered softly, his voice clear enough for me to hear, "I've been waiting for this moment for a long time." His words filled me with dread. I couldn't comprehend what I had just heard. My mind spun as I struggled to understand what was happening, but the realization struck me like a tidal wave. The doubts and discomfort I had dismissed as paranoia became a horrifying reality. Ethan sat down beside me, his expression calculated, his smile sinister. I lay there, powerless, unable to resist or escape. All I could do was listen as he began to speak, his words ringing in my ears, each one revealing a chilling truth I had never imagined. He confessed that since I had started college, he had developed feelings for me and had been determined to get close to me. When his initial attempts failed, because I kept my distance and avoided him, he decided to take another approach. Ethan began to dig into my personal life, learning everything he could about me. When he discovered my family background, including my mother's circumstances, he devised a plan to get close to me through her. Step by step, he worked to gain my mother's trust, and it seemed effortless for him to integrate himself into our lives. Before I realized what was happening, he had become my stepfather, seamlessly blending into our family dynamic. Hearing these revelations felt like falling into a bottomless pit. I couldn't believe that every seemingly normal moment in my life had been part of his meticulously crafted plan. What I had seen as my mother's happiness was nothing more than a facade, the product of his calculated manipulation. The pain and disgust I felt were overwhelming. From the very beginning, everything had been orchestrated, with me as the ultimate target of his scheme. After finishing his confession, Ethan moved closer, his eyes filled with a satisfaction that made my skin crawl. I was completely immobilized, unable to escape as he approached. His gaze no longer carried the warmth my mother had seen, it was cold and predatory. I tried to recoil, but my body refused to respond. My heart raced wildly, but I remained trapped in a state of paralysis, unable to act on my terror. Ethan leaned down, his hands moving over me in a way that filled me with overwhelming disgust. He took control of my body with no regard for my will, and I could do nothing but lie there, paralyzed and powerless, enduring each excruciating moment. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second an eternity of fear and humiliation. I silently begged for it to stop, but it didn't. The world around me felt like it was crumbling. Everything I thought I knew was being ripped away by him. I wanted to fight back, to resist, but it was futile. My body was no longer my own. Each passing second was a nightmare from which there was no escape. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to dissociate from the horrifying reality, but the events continued, slow and torturous. The paralysis, the loss of control, and the violation of my autonomy shattered me completely. Every movement he made, every touch, felt like a blow to my dignity and sense of self. It was as if pieces of me were breaking apart, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I felt like I no longer had ownership over my own body, completely consumed by his actions. When it finally ended, I remained motionless, feeling empty and numb. The room felt cold, oppressive, and devoid of life. Ethan stood up, adjusting his clothes as though nothing had happened. While I lay there, paralyzed by the horror of what I had just endured, my entire world felt like it had collapsed. Everything I had believed in, every ounce of trust I had placed in others, now felt meaningless. My mind was flooded with anguished questions. Why had this happened? How could someone my mother loved, someone I had tried to accept into my life as family, do this to me. The pain, fear, and betrayal were suffocating, leaving me overwhelmed by despair and helplessness. Ethan glanced at me one final time, his eyes devoid of remorse, cold and calculating. Without a word, he left the room, leaving me behind with the unbearable weight of what had just occurred. I was left to grapple with the torment, the agony, and the obsession that would haunt me for years to come. I didn't know how to face the reality of what had happened or how to keep going when everything in my world seemed to have collapsed completely. As the effects of the drug began to fade, I slowly regained control over my body. Weak and lightheaded, I forced myself to stand, each movement bringing waves of pain. Yet, I knew I had to act. My hands trembled as I tried to straighten my clothes, attempting to erase any visible traces of the nightmare I had just endured. My eyes scanned the room until they landed on the phone resting on the table. It was my only lifeline, my only way to seek help and put an end to the horror. With shaky steps, I approached it, my hands still trembling as I picked it up. Dialing 911 felt like a monumental task, each digit harder to press than the last. When the operator answered, I took a deep breath, struggling to steady my voice, and began to recount everything. The police arrived quickly, though every second felt like an eternity. The moment they entered the house, the silence shattered. Voices echoed, hurried footsteps moved through the space, and finally, Ethan was taken into custody. He didn't resist. He simply lowered his head in silence as the officers handcuffed him, as if he knew it was over. Shortly after Ethan was arrested, my mother came home. She found me standing weakly beside the police, still trembling. At first, she didn't understand what was going on. When our eyes met, all the strength I had managed to hold onto vanished. I couldn't keep it together any longer. Tears streamed down my face as I told her everything. My voice cracked and broke as I explained the truth about Ethan, what he had done, and the horrors I had endured. My mother was stunned. Her wide eyes were filled with confusion and agony as she listened, saying nothing. She stood there, frozen, as though her entire world had crumbled around her. When I finished speaking, she collapsed into sobs, overwhelmed by grief and regret. Through her tears, she kept repeating, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," but I knew that no amount of apologies could erase the pain we were both feeling. That day changed our lives forever. My mother could never forgive herself, and I could never return to the life I once had. Even though Ethan was taken away by the police and a part of me felt relieved, the pain and trauma didn't simply disappear. I had confronted what he did, and justice had been served, but the scars of what happened lingered, refusing to fade. Hearing the full truth, my mother fell into a deep state of guilt and sorrow. She couldn't stop blaming herself for bringing Ethan into our lives and for not seeing his true nature. Overcome with regret, she decided to leave the house we had shared and close her boutique temporarily to find some semblance of peace. Ethan was convicted, and I knew I would never see him again. But even that wasn't enough to heal the wounds he left behind. He had shattered a part of my life, and no matter how much time passed, the pain felt like a permanent scar, one that would never fully fade.